The last session was all about motivation metaprograms, and this one is looking at what Shelley Rose Gervais calls the working metaprograms. And by the end of this session you'll be able to describe the working metaprograms, elicit them, and evaluate the use of metaprograms in coaching. Working metaprograms are concerned with people's preferences for how they work. They are useful to discover about how someone likes to work and can be used for interviewing and using people's strengths in the workplace. If you're using them in modelling, you'll want to find out which programs someone is running when they achieve their excellence. And in coaching, they'll help identify the programs that are helping the client and the ones that are not. We are going to look at 5 working metaprograms. They are to do with the person's working scope, working style, their working organisation, and the last 2 which are to do with how someone becomes convinced. The working scope program is about whether someone prefers the big picture or detail, whether they prefer the general or the specific. A question to ask to identify this program is, if we were working together on a project, which would you want, the big picture followed by details, the details, or the details followed by the big picture? The pattern can be recognised by the question and by virtually every sentence the person says. People with a preference for the general or the big picture like overview and summaries. They like concepts and abstracts. They like simple sentences, few modifiers or detail. And they may well present things in a random order. They prefer the big picture and can work with detail only for a finite time. Too much detail will result in boredom and them switching off. So if you want to influence a big picture person, you'll want to use language like the big picture, the main idea, essentially what we have to do, the important thing is, in general, and concepts, and leave out the detail. On the other hand, someone with a preference for the specific and detail focus their attention on less, but in much more detail. They do tend to speak in sequences and by step, and they'll often use a lot of modifiers, adverbs and adjectives in their language. And for the world to make sense, they need to have the detail. They may well become overwhelmed by too much big picture and disorientated because there's not enough detail in it for them to make meaning and sense from the situation. So with detail preferences, you will want to use language like exactly, precisely, specifically, details, and use sequences and lots of modifiers. I'm sure you can imagine what happens when a big picture person just talks in general terms to a detail person. And the other way round, when a detail person insists on giving a big picture person all the detail. And this is an important metaprogram. I remember I nearly lost a very large contract because of this metaprogram. I once wrote a general proposal to a big picture person who I'd gone to see, only to find out later that the proposal had been handed to his detail assistant. And the assistant was all for giving the work to someone else until I rewrote the proposal in detail. So, write a note to a big picture person about an idea you want them to consider. And then write a note to a detail person about the same idea that you want them to consider. The next program is to do with whether someone has a preference for working independently, around other people, or as part of a team. The questions that will identify this program are, what is important to you about work? And then you ask them, tell me about a work experience that was, and whatever that you put in there, the answer to their previous question. Let them answer that and then say, what did you like about it? So, for example, you may say to someone, what is important to you about work? And they say, variety in what I do. So then you'll say, tell me about a work experience that was full of variety. And they may say something like, well, it was a project I worked on last year. And then ask them, what did you like about it? And you'll listen carefully to the answer they give you. If the person says things like, I did it, myself, my responsibility, and they don't talk about other people, and the activity presupposes they did it on their own, then they are likely to come under the independent category. If the person talks about other people being present, but that they did it, and by the very nature of the activity and the way they describe it, there were other people present, then they will come under the proximity category. And lastly, if the person talks about we, us, our job, together, and includes other people and shares responsibility, they will come under the cooperative category. Independent people want to work alone and have sole responsibility. They like their own office. They can spend long time without craving contact of others, and in order to influence them, you'll want to use language like do it alone, by yourself, you alone can do this, without interruptions, you'll have total responsibility and control, just close your door and reroute your phone. Proximity people need well-defined responsibilities but need others involved, and need authority and others around. The type of language you'll want to use with them will be, you will be in charge. Others will be involved, but this is your baby. You'll direct, lead, your responsibility is X and theirs is Y. So that's the sort of language you'd want to use with them. Cooperative people believe in synergy, and they want to share responsibility with others. And they don't want to work on their own and will be influenced by language like us, we, together, all of us, the team, the group, share responsibility, do it together, you won't be alone in this, we could do that. So, to practice this, write half a page describing a job in ways that will appear attractive to an independent person. Then do the same for someone under the proximity category, and then for someone under the cooperative category. The next programme deals with whether someone prefers to work with people or things. The question to discover it is the same as for the last metaprogramme. And this time you're listening out for whether they speak about people, emotions and feelings, and name people, and use personal pronouns, and that people are the object of their sentences, or whether they talk about processes, systems, tools, ideas, tasks, goals, results, and will not mention people much, and if they do, people become object, part of the process. Those with a person preference pay attention to feelings and thoughts. Feelings become the task itself, and they will organise work so that they can focus on people and feelings. And they're very good at creating rapport. And in order to influence them, you'll want to use language like personal pronouns, people's names, feelings, thoughts, experiencing. This will feel good for you, for others, the people, our team, our group. That's the sort of language that they like to hear. Those with a preference for things concentrate on products, ideas, tools, tasks and systems. They treat people and ideas as objects and believe that emotions have no place at work. And they're usually very task-orientated. And in order to influence them, you'll want to use impersonal pronouns and language like things, systems, objects, tasks, objectives, process, get the job done, focus on the task in hand, the goal, the results. You can imagine the conversation when someone with a person preference is in a meeting with someone with a thing preference, and how many opportunities there are for conflict and misunderstanding. However, together they can work well to make sure both aspects are considered. Write an email about a change you would like to make to someone with a person preference. Then write an email about the same change to someone with a thing preference. The last two patterns are to do with how someone is convinced about something. These two are important if you are coaching, because at the end you'll want to help your client be convinced of the change that they have made. So knowing how they are convinced helps you move them forward. It's also important if you're selling to someone, be in products or ideas, and you'll want to discover how they prefer to have information so that they can make up their minds whether it's right for them or not. And you'll want to know these if you're modelling excellence in someone, to discover how they become convinced in the strategy that they use. The first pattern is to do with what channel they like to gather the information presented to them to start to be convinced about something. Do they like to see something, hear it, read about it, or do it? So the question you want to ask is, how do you know that someone else is good at their work? Or, how do you know that a car is worth buying? So if someone says they have to see the person at work or see the car, then you'll want to use visual language with them, such as see, look, show, perspective, image, etc. For example, you may say, I wonder if you can see right now just how many ways you can use what you've learned. If someone says they need to hear about it from someone else, then you'll want to use auditory language and say things like, I'm sure when you've talked this over with your manager, you'll realise just how much you've learned. If someone says that they need to read about it, then you'll want to talk about that and use sentence like, well, when you've read the feedback, then I'm sure you'll be aware of just how much you've learned. And lastly, for someone who says that they need to do something, then you'll want to use kinesthetic language and say things like, and as you feel more confident now, I'm certain you'll have a grasp of how much you've learnt, and particularly as you put it into practice. So we have gone through the working metaprograms, and in the previous session the motivation metaprograms, and I'm sure you're already realising just how useful they can be. So here's an exercise to help you become familiar with the working metaprograms. Work with a partner and use the questions to discover their current working metaprograms in operation. How could you use your knowledge of convincer channels and convincer modes in coaching? How else will your knowledge of metaprograms help you in your work apart from in coaching? Write down the answers to these three.